The final point, of course, is other external powers. What about European countries? What about the European Union having some kind of engagement? What about NATO as an institution having some kind of engagement with the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative and the Far West, the Mediterranean dialogues, or maybe something beyond that? Or is that going to be a no-no? One of the key issues in this as we go forward is the extent to which in any kind of structure and in terms of overall security, the United States is going to be necessarily a welcome country, and whether NATO would be a welcome substitute, or the EU would be a welcome substitute for that. We have to remember there is always the question to be faced about whether the presence of American forces in different countries is a lightning rod for terrorists. If I had to talk about one supreme error I think we made, I said so at the time, was keeping American forces in Saudi Arabia after Desert Storm, which became a wonderful rallying point for these thugs that we talk about with Al-Qaeda and the others. Now, what are the criteria for getting an effective structure? I'm going to throw out a few here as part of the herding kit. It's a welcome commentary, challenge, and other recommendations as we get to questions. First, I've already indicated, there has to be a critical mass of countries who say it is worth doing this rather than just having anarchy in terms of our long-term security and our long-term ambitions with one another. We can already look at, it's very difficult, you already look at the Gulf Cooperation Council, and where you have the relationship with NATO, only 4 of the 6 are taking part in that, and in which the GCC is still, shall I say, a work in progress, maybe not sometimes even a work very much in progress, but there has to be a decision and somebody to lead the coalescence on that, whether it's the United States or someone else, to say this is important to do. Secondly, I think it needs to be done in terms of a building block approach. This isn't going to be brought into being in one fell swoop, such as we had in the creation of NATO. And there was always the precedent of the Baghdad Pact and the Central Treaty Organization of what happens when you reach too far, too fast, and make with the wrong partners. But this has to be done sensibly, or it's not going to be done at all. Third, there has to be willingness of member states to consider as part of a building block approach what I call a group of confidence-building measures, to borrow a term from elsewhere. These should, I think, include a number of things. One, to create a number of political and military commissions beginning in Iraq, with all interested powers in regard to Iraq, to the extent to which there is a government willing and able to do this, but then broadening into others. The very fact of sitting down and talking with one another about the reality of security issues in both the political and the military dimension. And I know how difficult this is even in the GCC countries, who tend to run away from it. And whether you have an empty place for the Iranians or maybe an active place for that is something to be looking at. The creation, perhaps, of CSCE-like arrangements, a Conference on Security and Cooperation in the Persian Gulf. Others have already suggested. In fact, this is in a couple of treaty relationships. It's in the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, for example, is something that could be created later on. The kinds of things which are functional approaches where there are common interests that may have a political impact later on. Partnership for peace, barring instruments that have worked elsewhere, which may indeed possibly have an application. Partnership for peace type arrangements, or what we have in the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council-like relations. Not to say you import them wholesale, but it gives you a methodology for thinking about what might be possible. To create, for example, a Persian Gulf counterpart to NATO's SCEPSI. If you haven't heard of that, that is a coalition of organizations in the different countries that deal with natural disasters. One of the earliest things that was done between NATO and post-Soviet Russia was precisely in this, because every single country in the world, governments have to face things that happen to their people. Oil fires, earthquakes, floods, epidemics, whatever it is. And the possibility of cooperating on that can be very real. You take it to the extent you can. Anything in the Middle East, take it out of politics. I'm not sure you can do anything. To draw on the experience of either ASEAN or the Organization of the Islamic Conference. If you read their statutes and what they actually do, there's an awful lot in there that could be built upon. In fact, when it comes to terrorism, the compact you have in the OIC sets a tremendous framework for doing this. It has one problem, which is it says that activities that are in terms of national liberation, everything that's exempt. I don't think that that's something you can have a real terrorism compact with, but it's a beginning. And then a couple of 3 things I think that could be done right away, including the Iranians, if you want to look at it. Number 1, an incidents at sea agreement, like we had with the Soviet Union in 1972. You look what has already happened in the Persian Gulf, like that incident between the British, the Royal Navy, and the Iranian Navy, whether it was done by the Iranians as an act out of Tehran, or was just some delegated members of some organization that had the dust up with the British. What would have happened to those than us? What would have happened? We have a circumstance there where you could have tremendous escalation from a local incident simply by the congeries of forces that are located there. That may remind you that what happened with the Spanish-American War, the USS Maine was in Havana Harbor in order to intimidate the Spanish. Hyman Rickover thinks that it blew up through spontaneous combustion in a coal bunker. Well, I think we need something like that in the Persian Gulf. The second thing would be freedom of shipping. Every single country that's involved in the Gulf has an interest in freedom of shipping, including through the Strait of Hormuz and also counter-piracy cooperation. You know, the Iranians actually have some ships that are a couple of ships that are operating off Somalia or in the Gulf of Aden, but they aren't part of the rest. Maybe that's something that could be worked out. Another thing, of course, is a methodology for defining the amount, quality, type, and interaction of military capacity in each of these countries. One of the problems in this region has always been, is also with regard to the Israeli region, is that high-powered equipment developed for in other parts of the world, and in the Cold War, you put them on a region of very short distances, warning time becomes virtually non-existent, and then you never know what is going to happen, perhaps by accident. Possible to work on confidence-building measures with regard to that. I've already mentioned that a security structure, whether you do it on the basis of universal membership or universal less one at the moment, with an empty chair. Anti-terrorism compact, I've already mentioned. Possible role for external security-related institutions like NATO and the EU, but within the tolerances of local countries. Roles for other external actors. China and India are becoming much more deeply engaged, and the Russians continue to have an interest. As we look at what we may be doing, we Americans might be doing with locals, we cannot ignore the roles they already play, and whether these 3 external powers will have more of an interest in stability than they will in terms of what might be their individual national